Welcome everyone to our Ask the Experts webinar today. We appreciate each of you joining. We're grateful to be able to spend the next hour with you. My name is Drew Niehaus, a managing director at Riveron, and I'm joined by two of my colleagues who are experts in this space and are currently working on a number of risk assessment, internal controls, and SOX readiness projects. Matt Farrell is a director in our Chicago office, and Michelle Patton is an associate director also in our Chicago office. So over the course of the next hour, the three of us are going to shed some light on how finance, accounting, compliance, and internal audit teams should be thinking about risk and controls in the light of an accelerated pace of change within organizations. With so much effort and time spent focusing on executing these transformational changes, be it business combinations, technology transformations, significant changes in human capital, there's a lot of time there's limited bandwidth and runway to consider the risks inherent to these types of changes and how an organization should assess and address those risks, including throughout their controls environment. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from each of these experts and their experiences they highlight for each of you, what you can be thinking about from a risk and controls perspective as you work through these types of organizational changes. Before we jump into the content today, a few key reminders. On our website, riveron.com, you can access our previous Ask the Experts webinars. There are a number of great accounting and reporting topics hosted there. During today's webinar, we're going to include 4 polling questions, each of which must be answered in order to qualify for CPE. So please make sure to enable your pop-ups. Also, we welcome your questions. There's a Q&A option in Zoom that you can use, so please feel free to do that. We'll try to get to your questions, time permitting, but if we don't, we'll respond separately. The webinar evaluation form and CPE certificate will be mailed to you in about a week, along with access to the deck presented today and our contact information. And note that while the on-demand video of the webinar is going to be available on our website, the on-demand version isn't CPE eligible. With that, let's dive right in. Matt, can you take us through some examples of the types of changes we're seeing companies working through today to kind of set the stage for our discussion?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Drew. So as Drew alluded to, the focus of our webinar today is going to be on some key impetuses of change in the business world that we're seeing in 2022 and how a company's governance, risk, and compliance program can best prepare for them. So the challenge of any governance, risk, and compliance program is to stay in lockstep with a constantly changing business environment. These past few years has seen more capital market activity than any year since the turn of the century, with an uptick in both IPOs and SPAC activity. While capital market activity has subsided a bit as of late, M&A activity has ramped to kind of supplant that to historic levels. The COVID-19 pandemic, lockdowns, and subsequent reopening sent organizations scrambling to adjust to remote working arrangements, new technology solutions, the Great Resignation, and the return to the office. Post-pandemic, change continues to remain constant, as the recent conflict in Europe has exacerbated supply chain issues, while regulatory requirements around ESG disclosures continue to evolve. Now more than ever, it's imperative for GRC programs to adapt and stay one step ahead of the constantly shifting risk exposures that each business faces. A robust and nimble governance, risk, and compliance program can drive significant value in the form of increased investor confidence and a narrower range of outcomes in the pursuit of key strategic initiatives. As organizations look to ensure effective governance, risk, and compliance, it is important to focus on these key impetuses of change in 2022. As you can see on the slide here, we have kind of noted some of these common drivers of change that are kind of prevalent in today's business environment. And frankly, anyone operating in this environment should be cognizant of. We'll take a deep dive into each of these catalysts of change over the course of this presentation and how organizations can react to them. But before doing so, I wanted to first take a look at some of the common drivers of deficiencies in control environments. I just wanted to flash this up on the screen. Some common scenarios that often give rise to a significant deficiency or material weakness are noted on screen here. As I'm sure you can quickly see, several of these catalysts of change from our prior slide are also some of the most common drivers of deficient control environments. So I'm hopeful that this helps hammer home the importance and relevance of our topic of focus here today. While these factors are historically common pitfalls, we are seeing these catalysts materialize in volume in today's business environment. So with that, we'll jump to the first polling question here.
Yep. Thanks, Matt. So polling question number 1. How confident are you that your organization effectively assesses and mitigates access risk? Very confident, A, very confident, B, not very confident, C, unsure, or D, everyone has access to everything. We'll give everyone a little bit of time to respond. And as we're waiting, Michelle, a question for you. Can you talk briefly about some of the steps an organization should take when they're thinking about how to remediate a material weakness?
Sure thing. Most often, I see organizations getting material weaknesses not due to some singular control issue that flew under the radar, but rather because there was a pervasive problem across multiple controls. Management needs to take a step back and unpack the underlying issues, digging deep to the root cause. Only then can they begin to think about the best course of action to remediate those issues. This action plan may include the implementation of a new system or tool, or the hiring of additional personnel. We'll discuss new technology solutions and human capital here shortly. All right, and looks like our results have trickled in. Most respondents are pretty confident. So let's go ahead and dive into how risk and controls can be considered in times of change. Our first area of focus will be new technology solutions. Technology continues to be a driving force behind organizational change. Since the pandemic, we've seen organizations implement new solutions in record numbers. According to a recent KPMG study, by 2023, more than $7 trillion will be invested in making work digital. And I imagine all of us on this call today have seen those investments come to fruition within our own organizations. I'm actually participating in today's session from my home office. And I have access to Zoom, Teams, internal teams within Riveron, and external to some client instances, as well as some client-specific tools and applications like Wdesk. So as organizations implement these new technologies to keep their workforces armed and capable, they should be thinking about more than just the desired end state of implemented and operating smoothly. Risks and controls should be considered at the first discussion of implementing a new tool or application. In order to wrap your head around how risks and controls are being addressed as new tech solutions are being rolled out, ask yourselves a few questions. First, do you have a robust integration plan for each new solution? Have you considered how existing processes and controls will be impacted by the change? And lastly, how do you currently work with third and fourth parties? Do they need access to these new solutions? In the wake of constant changes, this can start to sound a bit like a broken record. It's one more thing and another, and thinking through the impacts on risk and controls shouldn't be the straw that breaks the camel's back. So mindful considerations up front will pay dividends later. So let's start with the risk assessment. Consider your IT environment. What do you have on premise? What's being managed by third parties? And how will existing applications need to talk to new solutions? Be sure to think through the handoffs between various systems and the different access requirements of each. Next, engage with relevant parties to develop a robust project plan for each tech implementation. Talk to the end users of each solution and understand what information they currently use to perform various tasks and how that will be altered by the new solution. How are they performing existing controls? You'll need to understand if the new solutions will alter current processes. The robust project plan will lend itself easily to leveraging a system development lifecycle approach. Understand the requirements, go through the design work, develop, test, implement, document, and then evaluate. Controls around change management will be especially important here. Prior to any data migration, we should be confident in the integrity of our data. We should further identify any key reports generated from the new tool and ensure our data is complete and accurate. The change management is only part of it. Don't forget about access management and cybersecurity. Who needs access to these solutions? Do our third parties need any level of access to continue to provide services to our organization? What about their third parties, our fourth parties? Access management and cybersecurity should be thoughtfully considered with each implementation. So let's move on to hybrid work environments. Hybrid work environments have been a pretty hot topic lately. As we've made significant shifts towards remote work, organizations' GRC programs have a whole host of new risks to contend with. And as almost 60% of employees note they prefer a hybrid work environment, many of these risks are here to stay. Organizations have been operating at 110% to get it all done, to increase collaboration capabilities, to do just all the things required in an attempt to keep operations afloat. Given the changes that were made at the speed of light, time and attention should be spent on existing conventions and controls to ensure they remain effective. Cybersecurity remains a constant concern. There has been a significant increase in cyber attacks since 2020. And it almost feels like a breach of some kind is reported by the media daily. And those are just the ones that are substantial enough to make headlines. To combat cybersecurity concerns, it is important to understand how data is being protected through the use of new tools that enable our increased collaboration. And it's not just cybersecurity. Since the start of the pandemic, organizations have had to contend with new, constantly changing health regulations. It is a challenge in and of itself to operate in a hybrid environment when the rules may be different tomorrow. So let's consider a few things from a risk and controls perspective. First, training. Success favors the prepared. Governance, risk and compliance, and internal audit functions have provided considerable levels of training to the business in recent years because they've had to really think through how controls are executed and evidenced in a remote environment. And if hybrid, where individuals within the same function may choose their own work location, they've had to consider the impacts on the three lines of defense. Are the control performers in the business executing controls in the same way, whether they're on-site or at home? Is the compliance function able to stay up to date with policy implementation and new regulations? Can internal audit effectively review items in line with enterprise risks and their audit plan? Changes to ways of working should consider each of these areas. When we talk about hybrid work environments and the impacts they have on risks and controls, I'd be remiss if we didn't spend some time on the increase in collaboration tools. Innovations in tech were sped up to accommodate working from home. Organizations should consider how data is being protected with the increased use of these collaboration tools. Are individuals able to freely share files between the organization server and their home networks? Overall, I think the big picture and how new processes and controls implemented to accommodate hybrid work will fit into the existing risk and control environment. Which processes and controls will be forever altered? How will the execution of these controls be documented, given they are challenged by a lack of physical oversight? So spend some time thinking about how evidence should be recorded and maintained in this environment. Now let's talk about human capital and the Great Resignation. The stats you see here, they're staggering to me. That there's nothing more I can say about that, right? It's in March of 2022, just a few short weeks ago. It almost seems like yesterday. 4.5 million people left their jobs, and there were 11.5 million job openings over that same period. As a risk professional by trade, this raises some unique risk flags for me. And I'd be surprised if anyone attending the session could say they haven't been impacted by the Great Resignation. And there are a couple things to consider. With vacancies on existing teams, a small team may be expected to do the same with less. And new people may be joining teams doing new things, not just new to them, but new to the team overall. And new tech may be deployed to accommodate to help fill the gap. This can have significant impacts on a company's control environment. Key control owners may be the individuals who have departed. New joiners may not fully understand their role in the execution of existing controls. We spent some time on tech already, but consider how automating workflows can get a little sticky. So how do we get ahead of this? Or likely a better question, how do we get a handle on this? Start with understanding your existing business processes and controls. Document them. If a key person were to leave, it would be beneficial for another team member or a new joiner to be able to pick up a thoroughly documented set of process flows and controls to understand the flow of information, the review points, the various system handoffs, and so forth. Having a robust set of process and controls documentation will pay dividends as organizations contend with increased turnover. This same question applies to automation, or the same concept, excuse me, applies to automation and visualization tools. An organization needs to critically analyze and understand the tools in place or tools being implemented to be able to achieve business goals while maintaining good controls. I think it's time for another polling question. Drew, could you take us through this one?
Thanks, Michelle. Yes, polling question number 2. How has your organization experienced heavy turnover last year and this year? A, everyone's new. B, we have a few vacancies. Or C, minimal turnover. Everything's pretty much the same. So while we're waiting, Michelle, just staying on this topic, what are some of the things that we're seeing organizations doing to address these high levels of turnover?
Yeah, great question. I've seen a lot of my clients implement all sorts of new policies, including things like design your day, where employees are able to work from whatever location makes them the most comfortable. I've seen organizations really amp up their virtual happy hours to keep everyone connected while being away. And enhancing company culture has really come into the light recently. With employee turnover as high as it is, the little things an organization can do can really go a long way. And I think that's really important because even the most committed resource you have, the most reliable person on your team, the one that you feel is never going to leave, the odds are they're being recruited on the side. Those conversations are still happening, and they need to be kept in by the flexibility and the perks that our organizations are offering.
Thanks, Michelle. Looks like the results are in, and interestingly, maybe not surprisingly, it's somewhere in the middle ground, right? Most organizations and folks have a fair number of vacancies, but not at the extremes. So Matt, let's shift back to you. I know we worked on a number of IPO readiness projects together. Can you take us through what organizations who've recently completed an IPO or maybe considering one should really be thinking about from a risk and controls perspective?
If I could find the mute button. Absolutely, Drew. So, I wanted to flash up on screen some of the statistics that kind of show the, the growth in the capital market space here over the last few years. As you can see, I think the primary takeaways here that both of these charts detailing, the number of IPOs and SPACs over the last several years are both moving up and to the right. And so that, just indicates that this is, an increasingly an option that organizations are seeking to, kind of advance to the next level and kind of get the funding to, enable that next stage of growth. I think it is interesting here as monetary conditions have tightened here in the first couple quarters of 2022. We have seen this activity drop off a bit, but in all likelihood, that's temporary. Like most things, there's a good degree of cyclicality to M&A activity, and we fully anticipate that this activity will ramp again in short order. But ultimately, I think it's still an important topic for organizations to think through. Is it it may still be a possibility that's on the kind of future perspective roadmap for your organization, or alternatively, with the boom in this activity over the last 2 years, I think it's important to note that there's a great deal that goes into going public, whether it's via IPO or through the SPAC route. And oftentimes the compliance related efforts and work streams are deprioritized for in in the opinion of Drew, Michelle, and myself, that's probably not the best approach. But the fact of the matter is that's what often happens, as there's often competing priorities. So needless to say, taking that leap to become an SEC registrant, it comes with a host of challenges, and not the least of which is ensuring that your internal controls are up to regulatory standards that didn't come into play, when your organization was private. So on the next slide here, I just wanted to kind of put up on screen some of the various work streams that feed into the process of a company going public. This is kind of specific to an IPO, but I think the point remains the same for SPAC activity as well, that there's just a number of ongoing efforts that are required to kind of get us across that finish line of kind of accessing the capital markets. And ultimately, compliance and the governance related work streams are as mentioned just a moment ago, often deprioritized. So just wanted to kind of highlight this and kind of bring back to everyone's attention here. It's many organizations have taken this leap via IPO or SPAC over the last few years, and often the compliance related efforts can fall by the wayside. So just always prudent to kind of reassess where we're at in our kind of path to maturity in achieving compliance. Similar to capital markets, the rise in capital market activity, we've also seen a significant jump in M&A activity. So if we jump to the next slide here, I think we got a couple of graphs that similarly are moving up and to the right. So again, takeaway being that this option, presents itself more and more frequently in today's business environment. And so, people should be cognizant of, what are the implications of taking that leap, whether it's via acquisition or divestiture, as it relates to our governance, risk, and compliance program. So one important thing to note: so when we're going through an acquisition, if we're acquiring a company, effectively, we don't have to assess the impact of the acquired business's control environment until effectively our 1-year grace period has transpired. Now that's a double-edged sword, in that it often results in the deprioritization of the compliance efforts as it relates to acquisitions. I think oftentimes, executives are focused on making 2 + 2 = 5, and trying to drive some of the operational and strategic initiatives to realize the synergies and enabling that accretive acquisition. That said, I think it's important for organizations to act swiftly to assess and understand how making an acquisition impacts the materiality of given accounts and given locations, and ultimately how that could ultimately have implications on our scoping of our compliance program accordingly. So I think the most logical first step for any organization to take in pursuit of ensuring stable governance, risk, and compliance through an acquisition is to kind of assess and refresh the organizational risk assessment, inclusive of the newly acquired business. So understanding where formerly material accounts and activities have now fallen out of materiality, and similarly where newly acquired business functions will have to be under the microscope of our compliance function inevitably. So I think the takeaways here are be proactive. Start with that risk assessment, proactively work through documenting the current state, understand how we're mitigating the various risk exposures that present themselves in the various pieces of the acquired business. And then, furthermore, seek opportunities to standardize. Oftentimes there's disparate processes can lead to misunderstandings about how we're approaching various risk exposures, and standardizing the way that we kind of mitigate risk can help to prevent confusion. It can help to reduce the cost of compliance as well, and that the control environment is designed consistently across each of our business units. It helps in reducing the amount of time spent by the audit team and to kind of get comfort with design. It can also reduce the number of controls that we inevitably have to test. So ultimately reducing the risk of deficiency accordingly. All right, I think you're probably tired of hearing me ramble. Let's do a polling question.
Thank you, Matt. Polling question number 3. So many organizations are engaging in some sort of transaction activity. So which of the following best describes your organization? A, considering an IPO. B, currently engaged in M&A activity. C, anticipate engaging in M&A activity in the near term. Or D, none of the above. And while we're waiting, Matt, you've assisted plenty of organizations in thinking through their control environments after an acquisition. Can you talk us through just a few of the key steps here?
Yeah, absolutely. As I touched on the previous slide, starting with a refreshed risk assessment is kind of the logical square one to understand what is going to ultimately be of material importance to our overall control environment and ultimately our compliance program. That helps us just ensure that we're deploying our resources in the most efficient and effective manner to tackle the compliance steps compliance tasks at hand. Beyond that, I think it's imperative for companies to kind of convey effective tone at the top and culturally convey the importance of maintaining a robust and effective control environment, really regardless of materiality. I think it's important for the tone at the top to convey and champion the importance of executing on each of our respective control responsibilities, regardless of materiality. At the end of the day, there may be certain things that are more important to our SOX compliance program. But I think it's important to kind of stress and champion the need for always taking proper care to ensure that we're executing our controls and that they're embedded within our day-to-day job responsibilities. They're imperative to success in our positions.
I think that's right. Thanks, Matt. So the results are in. Looks like a lot of M&A and activity as we would expect, and as we're kind of experiencing as well, talking with organizations. So Michelle, let's get back to you. Supply chain's a topic we hear about constantly these days. I'm trying to buy a new car, and I was told I may have to wait until winter. Can you walk us through how supply chain disruptions are impacting a company's risk assessment and controls?
Yeah, absolutely. And after supply chain, we'll talk a little bit about ESG as well before we, wrap these up and drive home some key points. But the first point I want to make is these next two, supply chain and ESG, are arguably less about compliance and controls and the impact of a potential misstatement, but more so on the operational risks. So supply chain, let's start here, where the possibility of meeting forecasts can be strained, especially given what we see today. This is an area, like Drew mentioned, we see this outside of our day jobs. It's at the dealership, it's at the gas pump, the grocery store. Constraints on the supply chain they're visible just about everywhere we look. So it's no wonder that the common constraints listed here, and we've already covered into tech and human capital, excuse me, have an impact on how we think about our risks and our controls. We often have to ask ourselves, how do we get ahead of the unknown? So think about the big picture. The supply chain should be considered in your overall enterprise risk assessment. And in 2022, I wouldn't be surprised if some of those risks floated right to the top of your priorities list generated from ERM buildup sessions, followed by some very direct meeting invites to discuss things further and develop some sort of concrete plan that's, we call it concrete, but it's probably very flexible as things change and continue to change. That plan is going to be different for every organization, but the outline is very likely to follow a similar pattern. So you start with your known risks. Review different pieces of your supply chain to identify the key risks that impact those various links in the chain. Then assess them similarly to how you would approach your entity-wide risk assessment, this time with a narrower focus. Consider the likelihood and the impact of each risk and how prepared the organization is to address it. Reviewing mitigating actions to supply chain risks will fall to governance, risk, and compliance teams. And the insights from the GRC teams should enable the organization to plan for contingencies, as well as have an actionable approach that can be measured and monitored. Switching gears to ESG, this may be the hottest hot topic these days. And if it hasn't reached your organization yet, ESG, or environmental, social governance, and corporate governance, refers to a set of sustainability factors that companies use to develop their strategy to drive long-term value. This can include climate change, diversity and inclusion, carbon emissions, product safety and liability, business ethics, among many others. ESG brings a unique perspective to risks and controls. As organizations engage with stakeholders to determine which issues could materially impact their financial performance, leadership will turn to the office of the CFO. Implementing processes and controls for ESG will very likely reside in finance. So what do? First and foremost, if your organization has already appointed a leader for this effort, make sure someone from finance has a seat at the table for ESG related discussions. ESG audits are in our future, and finance will ultimately own this from a reporting perspective. They'll have the muscle memory from SOX and SEC disclosures to ensure that information is at that investor grade. Because even if you aren't a public company and you don't need to file anything with the SEC, this information will be going to your banks, private equity backers, your investors. You get the idea. It's going somewhere. Someone's going to be reading this, and it needs to be reliable because your organization will ultimately be held accountable for it. We spent considerable time today talking about what's driving change in organizations. But I want to pause there for a second. We're very lucky on this webinar to have Drew with us, who is leading, Riveron's effort on ESG. And I want to pause for a couple comments from Drew.
Yep. Thanks, Michelle. And we are getting a number of ESG questions coming in. So one of the things that has been a major shift domestically in the US is the SEC's proposed rules that they came out with in March. And heretofore, the SEC did have some rules issued about 12 years ago on how to consider climate-related disclosures, and specifically within the front of the document. The proposed rules, which is a 500+ page document, I recommend it for some good bedtime reading, cover a lot of new ground. And the reason I want to bring this up is, one, to give you a little bit of a preview of what's in there. We expect the rule to be finalized somewhere in the second half of the year, with some changes. It'll be interesting to see what comes in and what's out. But also that we don't expect this to simply be related to public companies. The SEC's rules, though, may be one of many catalysts that start cascading this down throughout the U.S. Right, there's a lot of drivers to why organizations should be addressing ESG, driven by numerous stakeholders, right? Whether it be ESG covenants and bank agreements and debt agreements, be it private equity interests and pressure, or just private equity, private equity prioritizing this, or other investors, board members emphasizing this. And the reality is that organizations who proactively address this, Michelle, kind of as you said, rather than looking at this through a compliance perspective, will be able to build this into their strategy to be able to hopefully not just view this as any sort of compliance or cost center, but rather drive long-term growth. And there's a growing body of evidence that organizations that are engaging with ESG topics have a lower risk profile and do have a larger long-term ROI than other organizations. So I anticipate that beyond just the SEC disclosures, investors in the private sector are really going to be focused on this in the future. But back to the SEC rules just really quickly, if you happen to be a public company, a new public company, or maybe considering a capital markets transaction, even in the next 3 years, I think it's important to understand a bit about the level of detail that hasn't been required in the disclosures in the past that will be required in the future. So, you may or may not be familiar with things like Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. Very quickly, Scope 1, that's emissions coming directly as the result of your operations. And Scope 2, that's largely driven by kind of like electricity consumption. And Scope 3 are things that are farther down your supply chain, for example, that are frankly more difficult to track. So those, depending on the size of your organization, things like carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide emissions, the Scope 1 things are going to be required to be disclosed as soon as next year. Based on working with organizations, there's a lot of diversity in practice with how companies are thinking through this, whether they're even getting this information and the level of maturity. It was interesting to me. I was on the phone with a large global multinational company, their CFO, about a month ago, and was looking into their sustainability reporting. Before that, they had SASB. They were a SASB reporter, which is one of the kind of frame standards around sustainability reporting. They had done TCFD reporting, which is specific more to the climate-related disclosures. Just kind of looking at some of their ESG scores from the Raters Rankers, they were quite high. And getting into the conversation, thinking they're a very mature organization, thinking through this. And I get on the phone with the CFO, and their first comment is, we're nowhere on this. And as we talked, it became evident that that's because the sustainability, the sustainability office and function was largely driven to this organization by the operational side of the business. It hasn't really been in the purview of the office of the CFO historically, but the SEC rules are quickly, making this be a matter of much more high importance to the office of the CFO, to folks like SEC and financial reporting specialists. And a lot of our conversations we've actually been reporting a lot of this. What are our controls around this? Have there been controls? What's the technology? Just the same lens that organizations would think through their financial reporting will now have to work through this in the sustainability reporting. And, it's very early on, and I'd say it's quite immature. There's a lot of spreadsheets being used, which I can imagine, give those of us in the risk and controls kind of profession a little bit of a pause in terms of how are we safeguarding those spreadsheets? What are the review controls around there? So there's a lot to be done with ESG from a compliance perspective. But I think what's interesting to me is I'm having more of these conversations is that those organizations that are really embedding this in their strategy and taking this, a little bit like a very holistic enterprise risk assessment, embedding it into that lens, are the ones that are really going to get the value out of all of this compliant effort as well. So I think the risk lens and the controls and compliance lens both apply really nicely to ESG. So thanks, Michelle, for letting me kind of expand on this topic a bit.
Yeah, I really appreciate the insights. There's just a lot going on here that I'm sure so many of us have a lot of questions, myself included. So at this point, we spent considerable time talking about what's driving change in organizations. And if your organization is going through any such change, hopefully this discussion so far has resonated with you. But Matt's going to take some time now to walk us through some challenges we may face during this transformation.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. Yeah, I wanted to talk through some of the common pitfalls that organizations face as they're navigating, the variety of transformations that we've discussed here on the webinar, and then also link them to some, potential success factors that can help to, overcome some of the common challenges that are often seen. So one of the challenges here is just a general move towards a reactive or firefighter approach. I think it's human nature to kind of tackle the the most pressing issue that's facing us in the moment. But I think it's imperative with these these big transformational efforts to proactively assess risk factors associated with the transformation. So go about a detailed project plan, understand what the the major prerequisites are for each subsequent step. What are the contingencies of achieving this? What are the potential roadblocks? Where do we have resourcing constraints? Things of that nature. Going about kind of a detailed project plan and furthermore kind of a what could go wrong analysis can help to get out in front of the common issues that often present themselves as we go through one of these major transformational efforts. Another challenge is identifying the right skills and resources to enable success. At the end of the day, oftentimes transformations are expected of people with day jobs. As Michelle touched on in the in the discussion around human capital and the Great Resignation, people are often being asked to do more with less. And at the end of the day, these individuals had full salaries doing their day-to-day job before this new transformational task and effort was thrust upon them, part and parcel to it. So, I think it's important to understand not just resource constraints, but also, ensuring that we have the right skill sets in place to tackle each respective phase of the transformation. Anyone who's been involved in a transformational effort is probably familiar with project delays. These can arise from a variety of different catalysts, but ultimately, I think it comes down to how do we get out in front of that, developing that detailed transformation plan, ensuring that we have effective monitoring of progress against that plan. That'll help drive accountability. It'll help ensure the communication is effective and keeping all the relevant stakeholders apprised of progress and kind of roping in, additional support where necessary to clear key and critical stage gates. As mentioned earlier in the call, compliance-related tasks are often deprioritized and unfortunately aren't addressed timely. So, I think I won't beat a dead horse here, but refreshing that risk assessment can help to kind of get out in front of where there may be new emergent risks associated with the transformational effort. And then, another common challenge is letting perfect be the enemy of good. I think oftentimes there's a lot of stakeholders involved in transformational efforts. Everyone has different perspectives, and to try and appease everyone 100% of the time is often not the optimal path and can can often bog down progress accordingly. So I think it's important to, identify the critical path and prioritize those items accordingly, deploying our resources to ensure that we're clearing the critical stage gates. And then finally, optimism versus reality. I think there's, a common tendency for people involved in transformations or any significant project to, don the rose-colored glasses. And while it's good to be optimistic and to look at the glass half full, I think it's also imperative to keep stakeholders, informed about the reality of the situation. So, I think this kind of segues well into, a discussion around transformational assurance and the role of internal audit and governance, risk, and compliance to provide that independent monitoring of progress and provide that assurance on the progress of the transformation. But before doing that, let's jump to our last polling question.
Yep, thanks, Matt. So polling question 4, how confident are you in your organization's approach to transformation? A, very confident, B, somewhat confident, C, not confident, or D, we're not currently engaged in business transformation. And I guess, Matt, while we're waiting, can you quickly touch on the role of internal audit or GRC in business process transformations? How can these functions work to maximize an organization's likelihood of success with all that's going on?
Yeah, absolutely, Drew. So, I mean, in my humble opinion, proactive planning and analysis is kind of the paramount effort to ensure success in these transformations. Doing so with a compliance lens can, as discussed, help prevent any, emergent deficiencies from arising through the course of the transformation. But beyond that, GRC can support the transformation by providing change management assurance. They can, kind of provide health checks and operational monitoring of the system development lifecycle approach. If it's a tech implementation, for example, they can help ensure that roadblocks are identified timely, and furthermore that outcomes are in alignment with expectations, and ultimately that deviations can be raised to the proper individual to drive the change that's necessary. All right, so it looks like the polling responses are in. It sounds like most of us are somewhat confident, which is probably about right. I think that's generally the flavor that I get from my clients as well. So all right, let's kind of talk about transformational or project assurance and the role that internal audit or governance, risk, and compliance can play in kind of ensuring the success in a transformation. So, I think the GRC function or internal audit function is uniquely positioned to, help assess the health and viability of a project. At the end of the day, they have that, kind of arm's length independence that, is required for them to, be able to independently assess the control environment. And so they, with that, kind of arm's length removal from the actual execution of the transformation, they can, kind of provide that that unbiased lens and help keep the key stakeholders apprised of progress. Assessing the risks and strengths of a new or existing project that that falls right in the skill set of any kind of GRC professional, and then ensuring that we are understanding the requirements for success. Where again, identifying where we may have bottlenecks, where we may need to ramp up resourcing to ensure that we're able to meet stated objectives. And then, kind of collaborating closely with the project team stakeholders and ensuring that we're identifying, prioritizing, and mitigating the various risk exposures that may arise through the course of that transformation. Ultimately, having this transformation assurance function in place can help drive transparency to the key stakeholders. It can help ensure a focus on operational readiness. And ultimately just enhance the visibility of the risk factors that, we as GRC professionals are just, you know, kind of trained and prepared to help identify. So with that, I think that brings us to the conclusion of our kind of scripted content here. I want to leave some time for Q&A at the end. I know there's been some questions coming through. Drew, do you have those?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. A number of questions have come in. I want to touch on at least one of them because I think it's interesting. We get it a lot. So this question reads along the lines of, hey, we're an organization that's in the process of being acquired. Things are a bit in flux. How should we think about our controls now as the acquiree? Michelle, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, a lot of thoughts actually. And I think it's interesting that we've covered the other half of it, right? Where I'm a public company acquiring an organization. What do we do there? I think we've exhausted that. But what about the other side where you are an SEC filer and you're being acquired by a private company? Does this suddenly mean that your controls can cease to exist? Well, no. Just because you're going private doesn't necessarily mean your organization becomes the Wild West. Good governance is a foundational pillar of organizational success. Your level of documentation may decrease. You won't be subject to SOX disclosure requirements, but a thoughtful internal control framework will certainly serve as a mechanism to support your organization's strategic goals, now, in the future, even after being acquired. So I would definitely recommend maintaining those internal controls throughout.
Yes, thank you, Michelle. And thanks, Matt and Michelle, for joining and driving the conversation today. So in closing, I want to highlight for everyone just some of the recent thought leadership on the next slide here on our risk and controls and governance topics discussed today, which you can find on riveron.com. We really appreciate everyone joining. Thank you for your time today. We look forward to meeting with you again in the future on other webinars. Please enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. Thanks.